Thank you to Dr. Ali for asking me to present our paper, which was recently published in Gastroenterology, entitled Inclusion of Underrepresented Racial and Ethnic Minorities in Randomized Clinical Trials for Inflammatory Bowel Disease. I'm Nathaniel Cohen. I'm one of the Advanced IBD Fellows at University of Chicago Medicine. Inflammatory bowel diseases have historically been described predominantly in Western countries and in white populations, but having said this, there's been a steady increase in both incidence and prevalence across the globe and in the United States in varying racial and ethnic groups. And we aim to describe, to see whether this was reflected in the racial and ethnic representation in IBD clinical trials and whether this changed over time. We systematically reviewed the Phase 2 and Phase 3 and open-label long-term extension trials which investigated efficacy and safety of the major FDA-approved therapies in IBD. And from these publications, we extracted or examined the racial and ethnicity data. We included 55 studies of 9 distinct therapies. Total number of participants was over 24,000. Most of these were Phase 3 trials. And we found that there was a distinct underrepresentation of racial and ethnic minorities in IBD randomized clinical trials, with very low proportions of blacks, Asians, or others represented in the clinical trials. There was also very poor reporting of race demographics, with only 60% actually including any race demographics, and of these, a third of them only mentioned the percentage of white participants. There was also very poor reporting of ethnicity demographics, with only 10 studies actually having any mention of ethnicity demographics. And all these studies reported this in a binary fashion as either being Hispanic or not Hispanic. None of the studies actually mentioned any limitations surrounding racial or ethnicity inclusion in their discussion sessions. We then did a time trend analysis to see whether this changed over time. And we saw that while there was a statistically significant increase in both the number of participating continents and countries, and there was also a significant increase in the race and ethnicity reporting in this last decade compared to prior decades, there was actually minimal change in terms of racial representation, with the percentages or proportions of blacks, Asians, and other patient populations actually staying very, very low. Reporting of race and ethnicity and the inclusion of diverse and underrepresented populations in clinical trials of therapies for IBD and medicine in general have been very poor. And the participation of Black or African American and Hispanic populations was very low across all the clinical trials, in contrast with the increased incidence in these populations, which has been recently noted. And while Black or African American and Hispanic people comprise around 30% of the US population, non-Hispanic and white people of European descent actually comprise over 90% of clinical trial participants across all fields of medicine. There is great importance for representative inclusion of all racial and ethnicity groups. Not doing so limits the generalizability of clinical trial results to all patient populations. It may affect our ability to ascertain differences regarding drug efficacy, safety, and toxicity, as there may be potential differences in genetic makeup and pharmacokinetics which are not taken into account. It also highlights the inequality minorities face accessing high-quality healthcare, particularly in the United States. And it also potentially hampers the provider's ability to garner the trust of patients when offering various treatments, and likewise may affect the acceptability of these treatments from a patient's perspective. There are multiple factors or reasons for these racial disparities in clinical trials, and these can be patient-related, such as suspicion to enter clinical trials, physician factors such as certain biases regarding intellectual ability, education level, the ability to complete a clinical trial or adherence, as well as structural-related issues such as the economic, education, and social ramifications of structural racism, and also access to quality healthcare, which is often limited for certain racial minorities. We propose action items to try and correct these inequalities, looking at the various stages of clinical trials. The preclinical, which would be studies investigating or reporting on racial inequalities, such as this present study. Looking at clinical trial design to increase or to ensure adequate power to examine efficacy and safety in underrepresented minorities, to ensure recruitment and adequate enrollment of underrepresented minorities, to improve reporting of the results of clinical trials and to include minoritized groups in the subset analysis from these trials, and then also post-approval to look at directed and dedicated communication and follow-up of therapies for underrepresented groups in phase 4 studies. So in conclusion, there is significant racial disparity and a very low proportion of racial minorities in the phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials of therapies for IBD. These disparities are likely due to multiple factors, and we propose that greater effort be made at multiple levels for the appropriate participation of all racial and ethnic groups in clinical trials. We believe that these initiatives will enhance equitability of clinical trials in IBD, they'll build trust between providers and patients of diverse backgrounds, they will further our understanding of disease processes and response to treatment in different patient populations, and ultimately all of this together will hopefully improve the quality of life and care for all patients, for all people living with IBD. Again, I would like to thank Dr. Ali for inviting me to present our paper. And I would also like to thank Dr. Rubin, without whom this work would never have been possible. And thanks to all of you for listening.